We're at Mark chapter 7, verse 24 to chapter 8, verse 26. Hear the word of the Lord. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hands on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looked up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on that way. And some of them have come from far away." And his disciples answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And they took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, what do you see right now? What do you see? What do you think? You see me with a backdrop of some musical instruments, and a blue and red wall, a screen with an image on it and some words. foreground. Got a pulpit. There's a table right there. Yeah, but what is it? What do you see all this as? You interpret the things you see. You might interpret this as you're saying, this is church. And so to you, a positive, a good thing. A visitor who wandered in here who had never been to church before might interpret it all as strange. Why this long lecture? And then it's like a school, but you're not tested over anything. And then why do they sing before and after? We don't sing in school. They might all look at this and think this is weird to people who don't know what to see it as. What do you see when you see people? Do you see someone maybe like you? Someone who could be a potential friend? Someone you could relate to? Maybe someone you think, maybe someone I can use. A potential customer. Someone you can get money from. You know, some people even come to church to look for customers. Mary and I once went to a church and someone tried to befriend her, and it turns out they were trying to sell, was it Amway or something like that? She took the person as being friendly to her, and then when she told the person she's not interested in the Amway products, the person was not interested in engaging her anymore. A potential customer, some people see others as. Some people, or maybe they look at another, if you're lonely, see a potential partner, if they're the right sex. And some people see, that's the way they look at things, some people see potential sexual partners. If they see people they can't use, like that Amway salesperson, sales lady, if they see someone they can't use, not going to sell anything to them, they hardly see them at all anymore. You just ignore them. What about people of another race? There are some people who hardly see race, as hard as that is to us to imagine. In Singapore, they had a TV show entitled Phua Chu Kang, which is a Chinese name. The big character was a Chinese character. The actor who played the leading role was Gurmit Singh. It's an Indian man, can't tell by his name. Now, to an American, it appears strange to have an actor of one race playing a character of another race. Singaporeans didn't see the problem. What do you see as worthy of respect? Athletes, maybe? Somebody you couldn't really respect. You see an athlete, when you see one, you think there's talent combined with self-discipline and hard work. Is that what you see? Or do you just see kids playing a game? Or maybe worse, they're adults playing a kid's game. Well, what's up with that? Maybe it's academics. You see an academic, a scholarship, that you see as respectable. A 4.0 grade point average, a PhD you see is something to be esteemed. How about wealth? You see a rich, successful person as deserving respect. You know, if someone makes it big in business, they're a billionaire. Do you think, he or she, they're a genius at their work. They invented something, they did something, innovated something. That's why they got all that money. That's the way you see them. Or you see them, they're a robber baron. They exploited others. They got rich off the backs of the working man or working woman to make themselves into a false aristocracy. You know, men like Andrew Carnegie, William Randolph Hearst, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt in the 19th and early 20th century, they were seen by some as these champions of business, these innovators, and so as great men, and others accuse them of they're robber barons. That term has now become passé, hardly anyone uses it, but we still have this conflict over how we see success in business. How do you see Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos? We like to think seeing is objective, that it's just obvious. Can't you see? He's a champion of business or he's a robber baron. It's just obvious. If only you could see LeBron James play basketball. Oh, you'd be in awe. You'd know that's worthy of respect. If only you could know people of another race. You'd see that they're just human, just like you, and you would relate to them. Of course, the fact is some people dealt with people of another race all the time, and they were still racist. What they see can't overcome their racism. If you could only see his doctoral dissertation, you'd respect that. If you could see what it takes to succeed in business, if you could see what went into innovating the first smartphone, the genius that went into that, or the Amazon distribution system, oh, you'd be amazed. That'd earn your respect. But it's not so. People can see all these things and still not see. Indeed, Paul says in Romans 1 that people, that is everyone to even the most vitriolic atheist, Paul says in Romans 1, clearly sees. In other words, it's obvious in creation. God's invisible power and divine nature. He says it's clearly seen in the things that have been made, in creation, in the universe, which declares the glory of God. Everyone can see it. It's been made known. But of course, I mean, even though anyone can see it, many people don't see it. They'll say, seeing is believing. But they're wrong. If they don't believe, they can't see. Well, we see here in 4 miracles in which Jesus revealed himself, we see him. Some see him clearly. Some only partially, in a step, in a stage. And some not at all. What do you see? Well, first, one sees Jesus. She sees him as Lord. She calls him that, and as one who has authority over the Spirit, she falls down at his feet. In verse 25, she sees Jesus as worthy of respect. Oddly enough, she's a Gentile, a dog. Now, Jesus has traveled clear across northern Israel from Galilee to be in the region of Tyre and Sidon, near the Mediterranean coast. That's Gentile territory. He wanted to be incognito, but his reputation has spread even there. And remember in chapter 3, great crowds had formed around Jesus with people even from Tyre and Sidon as he healed many. And they took news of Jesus to the people of Tyre. And one of those people was a lady with a daughter. Now the girl had, in verse 25, an unclean spirit. Jesus had just talked about how you can become unclean. Remember at the end of last week, what makes you unclean? By what comes out of you. Now a mother wants him to cast out an unclean spirit from her daughter. She begged Jesus in verse 26. Notice that. She begged him. In fact, we'll find that several times in this passage. People begging. Begging is taking the position of an inferior. Begging is what you do when you have nothing else to offer. You have no way other than begging to get what you want out of the other person. Nothing to offer in exchange. Nothing in my hands I bring, so I can only beg. Now, religion and moralism teaches that we can bring something. That we can exchange, we can bring something that we can use to exchange with God what we want. You know, we want blessings, restoration, healing. And we think that if we do the religious thing, we do the moralistic thing, we go to church enough, give enough, we'd be moral enough. We can then take that and exchange that, kind of like money, to buy what we want from God. Now, this woman knows that she cannot do that. She sees that she has nothing to offer. And Jesus has the power. So she begs. Jesus' response to her sounds to us, and the way we're taught to see things, awful. You know, admit it. If this were not in the Bible, and it were not from Jesus, and say we were told that someone like a pastor or a teacher or whatever responded like this to a needy person coming to him for help, and that person responded like this, like Jesus does here, we'd condemn this, wouldn't we? We'd condemn that. Especially we Americans today. That's the way we almost been trained to see things. That's the way we would see it. Of course, we're not seeing right? Look what he says in verse 27. Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, first, what we see in this analogy is that Jesus is saying that some people, and only some people, are God's children, his heirs, his priority. Some, not all. Some are God's children and others are dogs. Now that's already bad enough in our day in which we're taught that universal inclusion is sort of the ultimate good. You got to include everybody except for those people who don't believe in universal inclusion. You can exclude them, but never mind that. But what's worse in the way we see things is that in this analogy, he's just compared this woman to a dog. You understand what he's doing? He's saying, no, I'm not going to do it for you because I do things for God's children, not the dogs. Now, technically, literally, the word there in Greek is the dogs is a little house dog, an indoor pet, like our little dog. One commentator tried to say, this isn't as bad as it sounds, because he's not comparing the woman to like a wild dog out there as a scavenger. He's just comparing her to a little dog under the table, a little pet, kind of like we have in our house. And I was thinking, no, that's still, I mean, if you were compared to a little house dog, you would still find that demeaning. But that's what he's doing. He's comparing this woman to a little house dog, and by implication, seems to be making, remember the way we're taught today, be making a racist statement that her whole race, a bunch of you here in Tyre, where I've gone, it's just like a bunch of dogs, which is pretty much what the Jews of his day believe. This is what the Jews of his day would believe. That's why there's so much emphasis. There's teaching, there's statements over and over again in the New Testament that God loved the world. That is all kinds of people. That Jesus didn't die just for us. He didn't just redeem us Jews, it means, but for the whole world. Meaning people from every race and every nation. Those verses now often, by the way, get misinterpreted to say that Jesus died. People misinterpret it, say that Jesus died for every individual without exception, when they're really, remember the setting, the Jews would believe these other people are dogs, when what they're really saying, not that Jesus died for every individual without exception, but that Jesus died for every people, that is, every ethnicity, without distinction. Let the children be fed first. That is the people for whom he's come. God's children. Let them get the blessings of God's kingdom. That's what he's come for. They're his priority. Because he says it is not right, literally the word not good, it's a statement of morality, of rightness. It would be the wrong thing to do otherwise. It's not good to take the children's bread, what's theirs by right, because they're related to the Father. Not right, not good, to take their bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, who are the dogs? The traditional interpretation of the statement is that Jesus came first for the Jews. And so now is not the time for Gentiles like her to get the blessings of the kingdom. Oh, you got to wait, lady. Not your time yet. That's the traditional interpretation. The woman here understands that she's being compared to a dog. She gets it, right? Now, a lot of people would be offended by that. Probably all of us here would be. We were compared to a dog. We might think, well, how dare he talk to me like that? And just storm off. But remember, she's begging. She knows that she has nothing, not even dignity to bring. She knows that she has no right to a place at the Lord's table. Religion or moralism tries to get you to think, well, you can earn a place at the table. You just keep these laws, you do these things, then you'll get a place. You won't be a dog if you do that. You can earn your bread. Now, if she had been deluded by her religion or by her sense of dignity, she would have revolted at the idea of being compared to a dog. Instead, she accepts her status as someone who has nothing to bring. She has no right, she has no place at the table. Instead of claiming that she has something to leverage Jesus with and was to make him do what she wants him to do, something in her hands to bring to pay him off. Maybe today with our idea that need gives a right, we would think, but I need this, and my need gives me the right to demand it. My need gives me a right to have my need met. Well, no. Instead, she accepts the demeaning status and says in verse 28, yes, Lord. She's just been called a dog by her, and she responds by calling him Lord. Yes, Lord, yet. In other words, despite that, that's true, Lord. Despite that, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. What a perfect answer. And Jesus responds in verse 29, for this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. He's willed it, Jesus has, he's willed it done, so it's done because of the Gentile woman's humble response. She went home and found her daughter well. Now, the traditional interpretation of all of this is that Jesus came first for the Jews But this woman is an exception. She's an exception because she responded with such humility and faith. Like her just humble, brilliant answer, witty answer, just sort of earned her a crumb. That's sort of the traditional interpretation. But what if, instead of that, Jesus' statement is right? Let the children be fed first, for it is not right, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Then this Gentile woman, by her humble, nothing in my hands I bring faith, proves that she's not a dog after all. What if her faith proves that she's a child with a place at the table, for whom it is good to give her bread? Now, sure, we would see her, if we were like the people then, we would see her as a dog. She's a Syrophoenician. She's a Gentile, someone who's outside, who isn't one of the children of God, isn't one of God's people, isn't one of the Lord's sons and daughters who have a place at the table of his great banquet. That's the way we would see her. But then she says, I am a dog. I have no rights, no place at the table, nothing in my hands I bring. My religion, my morals, my status earns me nothing. And that humble faith proves that she's a child of God. She's one of the people for whom Christ came. So Jesus does what is good and gives her this blessing of the kingdom. What do you see? Well, the second miracle is after Jesus has traveled back, actually to east of Israel. He's gone not only across Israel, but actually on the other side of it, east of the Lake of Galilee and the Decapolis, the 10 cities, starting in verse 31. Some people brought to Jesus there a deaf man who could hardly speak. He stuttered a lot. He apparently wasn't born deaf because he had been taught to speak. I don't know. I would think it would be difficult, if not impossible, to teach a deaf, at that time, teach a deaf person how to speak. But he suffered some kind of disease or injury and now couldn't hear, and he stammered a lot. Now, the people who brought the man to Jesus also begged Jesus in verse 32. Again, begged. Notice the details in verse 33. Jesus takes the man aside privately. He's not going to make a spectacle out of him. Jesus isn't doing this to show off. And he put his fingers into the man's ears, then spits, apparently, he doesn't say, but apparently into his own fingers, and then touches the deaf man's tongue. So touching both his ears and his tongue. And then in verse 34, Jesus looks up to heaven, praying to the Father, and he sighs deeply. Sighs. This is the same word as in Romans chapter 8, verse 22, where the creation groans because of its bondage to decay, because of the calamity of the fall on the creation. It groans. Here, Jesus himself groans because this deafness and stammering is part of that calamity. We groan inwardly as we wait for our adoption as sons and daughters. That is the resurrection of our bodies. When we don't have to worry anymore about cancers or declining or broken legs. Until then, we groan from our suffering, from a fragile, declining body. Now, Jesus here sighs deeply for this man who doesn't yet have that body. He says, Ephphatha, that is, be opened, speaking it into being, giving him one of the benefits of the resurrection, hearing and speech. What do you see here? Just a healing, a miracle? What's it mean, though? Now, prosperity gospel people would say, well, this shows that Jesus can heal if you follow the right steps. You too can have your healing. Probably one of those steps would include giving them a big offering. That's how they see it. We tend to see everything in the Bible as a recipe, a pattern for what we should do. We can get this blessing if we do thus and so. We improve our habits. We do these disciplines. And sure, there's blessings for living. There is blessings for living God's way. It's a better way to live overall. But that's not what this is about. This is about the kingdom of God. Jesus sighs deeply, groans from his heart, because it's not yet fully come. The kingdom of God is not yet fully come. And this man is suffering for it. In Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and 6, it says that when God's kingdom has come fully and he's restored all things, then the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. The tongue of the mute will sing for joy. Jesus here is showing that God's kingdom has come. You see this man now speaking plainly. You should see that what you need is not first follow the steps of this religion, improve your life, give such and such amount of money. You should not see that. Instead, see that you need to turn from your old life so that you be born again and can be in the kingdom of God. See that Jesus is king. And as they say here in verse 37, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak, fulfilling Isaiah 35. They were so excited about what they had seen, that even though Jesus told them to keep it to themselves, they couldn't help but proclaim it. It's kind of funny. They see him for what he's done. He can do all things well, and yet they didn't turn around and disobey him. Their own confession should remind them of Isaiah 35, of the signs of the kingdom, and realize then that Jesus is the king of the kingdom of God. And so they should submit to him. Instead, they see the miracle, but they don't understand it. They don't know what they're seeing. And so they turn around and disobey Jesus. They don't see who he is. What do you see? Well, in chapter 8, the disciples see another miracle of feeding a multitude, just like in chapter 6. There he fed 5,000 men, and here 4,000 people. He's repeating a miracle like a good teacher repeats a lesson. Repetition is the mother of learning. Just like before, Jesus has compassion on the crowd. In verse 2, he says that they've been with him for 3 days, and now they have nothing to eat. If he dismisses them now, some will collapse for lack of energy while they try to get back home, and some of them have come from afar. Now notice that Jesus himself reports all of that. Why is Jesus here saying what the disciples should be able to see for themselves? Right? They should be able to see the situation as Jesus has described it. Thousands of people now without food who can't make it back home unless they get something to eat. Now, like before, Jesus has created the need. Remember in chapter 6? Jesus intentionally taught until that evening, protracted his teaching, and then he told the disciples, take care of the problem that he had just created by keeping them for so long. Here he kept them for 3 days. Now, any food they brought with them, they have consumed already. The disciples should look at this and see that Jesus can take care of the problem, right? They should have learned that lesson by now. They should be able to see that by now. Instead, they say, sounds like they're kind of shrugging their shoulders in verse 4. How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? How? We have no idea. We've talked about it. We can't figure out how to do it, Jesus. How are we going to do it? They didn't learn anything from the first mass feeding. So Jesus asked how many loaves of bread they have. 7. Not only does it literally have 7, but it's a symbolic number. They also have a few small fish. And then he has the people sit down on the ground. He gives thanks for the food. Right? Starts distributing it to the disciples to distribute it to 4,000 people. And somehow it's enough. Even more than enough is they're able to pick up 7 baskets full of leftovers. 7, again, a symbolic number for completion, for perfection. Jesus has completely fed the people in the wilderness, and now he can send them home, and he crosses the lake again to be on the Jewish side. What do you see? What you should see by now is a Lord who has compassion on his people, who will provide for their needs. And the Pharisees, though, they see someone to argue with. They demand from Jesus a sign, some token, like a miracle, that proves what he's saying. A sign. Give us a sign, Jesus. And his disciples, he's probably thinking, well, you mean like ordering demons out of daughters? Or healing a deaf and stammering man? Or feeding 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread. Something like that. Something like that. If we see it, we'll believe it, they probably said. Seeing is believing, right? Jesus has been overflowing in miracles lately. It should be no big deal for him to do one for these skeptics, right? He's done so many miracles. Why just one more? Just go find a needy person, maybe a cripple or a blind person or a deaf person, anything. Maybe if we're hungry, give him just a tiny little bit of food and have him feed everybody with it. Why not? Instead, in verse 12, he sighs deeply, again, in his spirit. This is the same word as before, this time, though, with a prefix showing that it's an even deeper sighing, a groaning from the bottom of his heart, in his spirit. The deafness and the stuttering and the cancers and the heart attacks and the Alzheimer's and the strokes and the death has creation itself and even the Lord groaning. But even worse, the unbelief, the faithless, self-serving, moralistic religion has him groaning even deeper within. It's an even worse curse of the fall. It's an expression of the lack of faith that is the essence of sin. Whatever is not of faith is sin. Moralistic religious people think of sin as just breaking some rules. Do these things, and if you do them, you're good, and if you don't, you've sinned. But sin can clothe itself in religion. It can engage, like here, in theological debate, demand proof, give us a sign. But why not do them? Why not do a sign? This whole section of Mark is full of Jesus doing signs, and right in the middle, the religious people demand a sign. Why not give them one? What? Just one more? Why not? Precisely because the blessings of the kingdom, the bread, is for the children. They're not tricks for the dogs. D.L. Moody said, Jesus sent no one away empty except those who were full of themselves. So Jesus declares in verse 12, why does this generation seek a sign? Because they don't believe. And seeing isn't believing. It's the other way around. Truly, I say to you, you can bank on it. No sign will be given to this generation. Not one that will actually make them believe. Because if you see him without faith, no sign will make you believe. With that, he departs. Jesus is now crisscrossing. I've lost count of how many times he's gone across the Lake of Galilee, just in this story, crisscrossing the Lake of Galilee. On the way back across, the disciples find that they only have one loaf of bread with them. And they start arguing about whose job was it to bring the bread? Someone should be in charge of the food. And Jesus tells them, watch out. You're only seeing one loaf of bread. And so you're seeing, what are they seeing? They're seeing a lack. They're seeing hunger. But you're not seeing right. So beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, leaven or yeast was the one thing in their time that people understood could be caught, that was, we would say, contagious. They may not have understood that there were microorganisms at work, but they could see that if someone took just a pinch from a lump of dough that was rising and put it in another lump of dough, that the same effect began to happen in the second lump. It too began to rise. They could see that the leavening could be transferred. It was contagious. They didn't know exactly what they were seeing. They couldn't describe scientifically what was going on, but they used it for what they needed for making bread. And this was the closest thing that they understood to what we would call now an infection. Yeast infecting one lump, being contagious and then passed on to others. So when the Lord Jesus here tells them to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, he was warning them against allowing the yeast, that is the infection, of their hypocrisy, of their empty religion. It's all about appearances and moralism. It's about laws you can keep. It's about rules to be followed, about eating or drinking this or that, or not eating or drinking this or that, but never dealing with the heart. Beware of being so hard-hearted that after Jesus has willed an unclean spirit to leave a girl, after healing a deaf and stammering man, after feeding a multitude, again, still, like these Pharisees, still, you're not seeing who Jesus is and demanding a sign. Beware of the religion, that kind of religion, infecting you disciples, the church. Beware also of catching the infectious disease that Herod has. Remember Herod? Loved hearing John the Baptist, but wouldn't obey it, wouldn't obey his preaching. Beware of enjoying the preaching of your favorite, whatever, strong biblical preacher, but of being too weak to stand up for him, of actually doing it, of living it. Beware of the love of preaching that's void of repentance and courage. Here Jesus is saying, in our terms, beware of catching what they have. Hypocrisy, the arrogant demand that God perform tricks to satisfy my doubt. Beware of a convictionless, spineless love of religion. You love religion, but you're just not going to obey it. You're not going to live it. Watch out, because that is contagious. It spreads like the coronavirus from one infected person to anyone who comes close to him or her. Well, the disciples hear that, say something about yeast, and they think Jesus is complaining about the bread. We were arguing about the lack of bread, and he's making some comment about that. They just assume. Jesus knows that all they can see is the bread or the lack of it. And so he says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? You shouldn't be worried about that, right? You seeing this situation here? Do you not yet perceive? You not see me? You not yet understand? Are your hearts hardened? That is, despite what you've seen, they still don't believe. Their seeing has not led to, at least not to full believing. It never does. Our hearts have to be changed. This is what is wrong with reducing the Christian life to kind of a stepped plan on how to be better. Do these steps. Be moral, be religious, do the right thing, give so much money, avoid the wrong, and then you'll be, if you do all that, then you'll be accepted. No. You need a new heart first, replacing that stone-cold dead heart, and only God can give that to you. That new heart will then see things differently. From your new, living, soft, warm heart will come faith. Believing. You will see. But still here, Jesus says to the disciples, having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? They've seen him feed multitudes in the wilderness twice. Now, think about that. They've seen him do that twice. Remember? He asked them in verse 18. He gives them a little quiz in verses 19 and 20. Remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you take up? 12. But they were eyewitnesses of that. And the 7 for the 4,000. How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? 7. They saw it with their own eyes. But seeing isn't believing. In verse 21, do you still not understand? Apparently not. Because they're arguing about bread. They're looking at Jesus, they're looking at one loaf of bread, and they're still thinking, we're going to run out of food, we're going to be hungry. They still don't see him for who he is. Speaking of not seeing, that is of having eyes but not able to see, they come to Bethsaida on the northeastern corner of the lake, starting in verse 22. And there some people brought Jesus a blind man. And again, they begged him to touch the blind man, to heal him. Begging, again, showing that they knew they had nothing to offer in exchange. They had no religion, no morality to impress him with, to earn some status that compels his attention. But Jesus responds graciously. In verse 23, he takes the blind man by the hand. You can see him holding the hand of this blind man, leading him out of this village again out of the spotlight. For the blind man, nothing in his hands he brings, but only to the hand of Christ he clings. In verse 23, what seems odd to us in the way we're taught to see things, he again spits. Here in Mark, it just says that Jesus put spit or saliva on the man's eyes. In John chapter 9, verse 6, Jesus mixed his saliva with some dirt to make a little mud pack and then cakes it on another blind man's eyes. Maybe he did the same here. Maybe mixed it with dirt. But that's not the point. It's the symbol of something coming from him, touching the one in need and being the instrument for healing. People at that time saw saliva as healing, as like an ointment. We see things differently. Try to see things through their eyes here. Now, the man doesn't see at all. He apparently was born blind because he knows what trees look like, kind of amorphous, undefined. And Jesus applied the saliva, laid his hands on him, and asked if he could see. The peculiar thing is why he is not instantly fully healed. Why isn't he completely healed the first time Jesus lays hands on him? After all, it's not a lack of ability on Jesus' part. It's not as though the first time he only had enough power to get him 50% of the way there and it took another effort to get him to full healing, full sight. No, that's not what's going on. The first time the man says he can see vaguely. He says he sees people like trees or the fuzzy, like nebulous blobs walking around. Why is he healed in stages? This is the way the disciples are seeing Jesus, in stages. They're not completely blind like the Pharisees. The religious people, demanding a sign, they're just totally blind. They don't see him at all. They're not that bad. But they aren't seeing him clearly yet either. They still don't see that Jesus is the bread supplier, the bread of life, the Lord. They see Jesus vaguely. They're seeing in stages. Maybe you are too. So Jesus laid hands on him again in verse 25, directly on his eyes, and his sight was restored. 20/20 vision, no glasses or LASIK required. Sending him home. Notice he sends him not back to that village that they came from, so he wouldn't tell the news that he had been given his sight. Why not? Because if they don't believe in Jesus, seeing the blind see won't help them see. Seeing isn't believing. Believing is seeing. Well, what about you? Do you see? Or are you only seeing in stages? I don't think you're like the religious people here, like the Pharisees, thinking they deserve a place at God's table, thinking with enough morality, with the right religious steps, that they can earn bread from God. They can deserve it. Come to God with something in your hands. Your decent life, your baptism, your offerings, your church attendance. Hopefully you see better than that by now and know, like that Gentile woman, that you can only beg. That it's only because Jesus has made you his child that you have a place at the table. But sometimes we see, because believing is seeing, but our faith is weak, and so is our vision. We mix a little religion, a little works and moralism into our gospel. Now is the time to see clearly. Spiritual 20/20 vision. So that when you draw your fleeting breath, when your eyes shall close in death, when you rise to worlds unknown, then you'll behold him, see him clearly on his throne. Believing is seeing. So, what do you see?